worlds, to all of God's creation. Prophet Muhammad is considered, according to the Quran, is considered an embodiment of mercy to all of creation. And it really is this idea of mercy that I think the world yearns for today. We turn on the TV and we read the news and we hear about all of the chaos that's going on in the world. The poverty and the death and destruction. All of the chaos that's going on in different parts of the world, where in many cases now, most of the time we find emphasis on division, on hatred, on enmity, on pushing people away from one another. And there is very little embodiment of mercy, compassion. Or even if it's there, it doesn't get the correct and right type of attention. And it is mercy that the world yearns for today. And this idea of mercy, I think, it can only be implemented, I think, if we're able to lay the foundations for mercy. You see, when the Prophet, peace be upon him, when we examine his life, yes, he was the embodiment of mercy, but he laid the foundations in his activities, in his interactions with people, so that he can then realize mercy. So he can actually embody mercy. He laid the foundations. And I think that it's important for us to think about how we can, as individuals and as a community, in our respect and celebration of the Holy Prophet, how we can lay the foundations so that we can also embody mercy just as the Prophet did. And I think that the way that we can do that is by first opening up our hearts and minds to one another and our ears to one another. Unfortunately, in many cases, we live sort of, in our own routine lives, and to certain degrees we may open up to others, to interactions with others. But how many of us actually really open up to the possibility of getting to know the other very, very well, intimately getting to know them? Introducing yourself, but also getting to know the other side. Not just learning about them, but learning from them. Listening to them. Opening up your doors, your spaces, your homes, your hearts to others, to listen to them, to learn from them, to get to know them. The Quran famously tells us, Ya ayyuhan nasu inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha. O humankind, we have created you from a male and a female. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ. We've made you into nations and tribes. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. With the objective of what? Of getting to know one another. Ta'aruf it's a two-way process. Getting to know one another. I get to know you and you get to know me. But in order to do that, we have to be able to listen to one another. We have to be able to open up our hearts and minds to one another. And this is why it's so important, I think, that as people of faith, especially as people of faith, that we are able to promote understanding, tolerance, recognition of one another. This is why, I personally appreciate the efforts of individuals and friends like Lee Wiseman, Steve Gilliland, and others, because they actively promote interfaith respect and recognition and appreciation, that they actively appreciate one another. We'll hear some of Lee Wiseman's stories, but Lee opens up, not only is he, online, not only does he possess the skills, mashallah, to interact online and draw a good, source of following and spreading messages of peace and understanding online. He has several projects we'll hear about, hopefully, a little bit. But also in person. Many of you here, sitting here, have actually been to Lee's home and have shared meals with Lee. He opens up his home to whoever wills and whoever wishes. And he takes the time to get to know you. He takes the time to get to know you. And it is through these bonds that we can really appreciate one another. It takes courage, brothers and sisters. It's very, very easy for us to dismiss one another, to turn away from one another, to close our doors in front of one another. But it takes courage and strength to be able to really open up to one another and to appreciate one another. But also, not just across religious boundaries, across religious faiths, but us also within the Muslim community. As Muslims, some of us here who adhere to the Islamic tradition. As Muslims, I think it's very important, and we will hear from our respected guest, Professor Sherman Jackson as well, on the importance of intra-faith appreciation, of getting to know one another, those who subscribe to the same religious tradition and teachings, that we get to know one another, and that we stand with one another, that we appreciate one another. The Holy Quran tells us in the verses that were beautifully recited, we began with chapter number 3, Al-Imran, verse 103. God says in the Quran, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, and come together, hold on all together to the rope of God, to the single rope of God, and do not be divided. You know, difference is natural. Difference is part and parcel of being a human being. As long as we are human beings and we interact in society, we will have differences of opinion, differences in lifestyle, differences in taste, differences in sensibilities. Differences are part and parcel of being human beings. In fact, we may even be able to make the argument that differences are divinely willed. There are some references in the Quran where God says, for instance, in chapter number 5, verse 48, لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا. To all of you, we have given a law and a way. وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَجَعَلَكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدًا. And had God willed, God would have made you into a single nation, into a single community. وَلَكِنْ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ فِي مَا آتَاكُمْ. But that didn't happen. And the reason is because God wants to test us with these differences. It's not differences that are bad. It is the way that these differences are employed that is bad. I've heard Professor Jackson numerous times say this statement. By the way, for those who don't know, Professor Jackson is actually my PhD advisor, so I'm trying to make a good impression on him. And for those of you who know me, and in fact, for that matter, for those of you who don't know me, if you speak to him tonight, make sure you throw in a good word. I've heard him say numerous times that Islamic law is hopelessly pluralistic. It's just designed that way. It's hopelessly pluralistic, right? Some have also attempted to make the argument that this pluralism is not just in the sphere of Islamic law, but also in the sphere of Islamic theology, to a certain degree, even in the sphere of Islamic theology and doctrine. You know, one very interesting point to keep in mind is that within the Shi'i tradition, actually, there are two, I don't know about the Sunni tradition, but within the Shi'i tradition, there are two main sets of traditions regarding the date of the birth of the Prophet. Some suggest the 12th of Rabi' al-Awwal, like today, and some suggest the 17th, 5 days away, right? But within the Shi'i tradition, there are also traditions about the birth of the 6th Imam, an Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, which tell us that he was born on the 17th. So according to some traditions, the birth of an Imam al-Sadiq, the 6th Imam, and the Prophet coincide, they come together. And if we look at the personality and the figure of an Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, he was one that both throughout history and until now is revered by the various scholars and the various schools of thought within the Islamic tradition. As far as I can tell from my own readings of the biographers and the historians, anyone who's mentioned Ja'far al-Sadiq has mentioned him in a positive light. He is revered. He is revered. In fact, some traditions note that even some major scholars, even within the Sunni tradition, they studied and they related traditions from him. One primary example is that of Abu Hanifa and even Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa, the two Imams of the Maliki and Hanafi schools of thought respectively. They discussed things with him. They learned from him. They transmitted narrations from him and from his father, the fifth Imam, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir. And some of you may not even be aware of this point, but I'd like to share it with you very briefly. That even the lineage of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, if we go back and you look at the lineage of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, you find that his father is an Imam al-Baqir, the fifth Imam. His mother is known as Farwa. Who's Farwa? Farwa is the great-granddaughter of Abu Bakr, from both sides, from her father's side and from her mother's side. She's the wife of the fifth Imam and the mother of an Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. A point that some of us may not even be aware of. And if we look throughout history, we find that between the various theological and legal schools of thought, there was always debate and discussion. 1,000 years ago in Baghdad, if you were to go into Baghdad, you would see people from various theological backgrounds, from legal backgrounds. Yes, it wasn't all great. They would get into some very heavy debates and polemics, to say the least. But in the end, they actually studied with one another. You have historians who note that major Shi'i scholars who studied with Sunni teachers and vice versa as well. And so this is part of the tradition. It's not difference. Difference is there. It's not that we call for putting aside differences, saying, no, we don't want to have any differences at all, because that's impossible. Again, part of human nature is that we have differences with one another. But that we employ these differences in a manner that is positive. We do not employ these differences in the service of division and tension, promoting hatred and enmity and animosity between one another. That's where the problem lies. And this is, in fact, where the Quran tells us, encourages us to avoid that sort of division. This is part of the tradition. It's up to us, brothers and sisters. I'll end with this. It really, I think, in my humble opinion, I think that our survival as a community is one that depends literally, not just us, but the survival of our children and grandchildren and the coming generations, depends on the extent to which we can come together as people who believe in God, as people of faith, as people who believe in God's message, in God's messengers, to the extent that we can come together and support one another and stand up to our common challenges. We have common challenges, brothers and sisters. If we decide that we want to engage in both inter- and intra-faith polemics, and that we want to close the doors to one another, and that we do not want to open up our hearts and minds to one another, we're going nowhere. And the people that will suffer are in fact ourselves and our children and our grandchildren. Thus, brothers and sisters, I remind myself and I remind you of this embodiment of mercy that the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, brought forth as an embodiment of mercy. And that we too can learn to embody mercy in our interactions with one another. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Almighty, to open up our hearts and minds so that we can come together and promote peace and tolerance and appreciation of one another. Finally, brothers and sisters, once again, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight, and we look forward to hearing from our respected guests. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وأهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.
All right, our next guest, of course, is Mr. Lee Wiseman. Here's a little intro. Mr. Lee Wiseman has been a member of the Jewish community of Orange County and a Jewish educator for over 25 years. For the past several years, Lee has also been an interfaith activist. creating bridges between Muslims and Jews. On Twitter with the edgy name Jihadi Jew. On his Facebook group, Abraham's Tent. And at interfaith gatherings in his own home, in synagogues and mosques. If you're interested in joining him for Shabbat dinner, both kosher and halal, see him after the event. Please help me in welcoming Lee Wiseman with the loudest salawat of all.
Adonai tiftach ufi gedilatecha. O Lord, open my lips that I should speak only your praise, that I should speak only truth. And thank you for bringing me to this wonderful place, these wonderful people, all potential guests. I want you to begin by taking in the site. It's something you don't get to see every day. I'm an unusual sight in this particular place. It reminds me of a story of a religious family that moved, a Jewish religious family that moved into a non-religious neighborhood in Jerusalem in the 1920s. And the women in that family dressed very modestly. They wore very long skirts and long sleeves, and they kind of stuck out in the neighborhood. And they went to the rabbi, the Chazon Ish, who was, at that time, was a very, very famous saint of the time. And they went to him and they said, we're the only ones. We're the only ones. And they were so frustrated. And he said to them, he said, when you're doing something you believe in, and even if there's nobody else doing it, never say you are the only one. Say you are the first. So I would like to thank Syed Hadi and your community for, if I'm not the first, at least I'm among the first to be doing this. So to prepare for this talk, I did what any self-respecting Twitter celebrity would do. I decided to crowdsource it. So to crowdsource it, what I did is I asked my followers, and this is a Twitter following of Muslims from all over the world, to share with me statements and traditions and stories of the Prophet of Islam that not only touch them, but change the way that they behave, that actually impact them, and to share with me not just the stories and sayings, but to tell me how those things actually impacted them. How did they change their behavior? And very soon I was inundated with these little glimpses of a man who lived 1,385 years ago. I hope I got the number right. But had a very profound influence on their lives in that very day. And as I read and I read, it started to become personal to me. Because I thought to myself, what would I like to be remembered for in 1,385 years? What would I want people to be saying about me if they were talking about me? Would I want them to know the make of my car? Would I want them to know the square footage of my home? Would I like them to know how many Twitter followers I have? Would I want them to know, how long it took me to upgrade to an iPhone X? Would I want them to know how well I cook? Says, what is it that I want people to know, or I would want people to know about my life in 1,385 years? And my Twitter followers, when they talked about the prophets, they didn't talk about the size of his herds. I don't think he necessarily had very many. They didn't mention the grandeur of his homes. He didn't even have a door. They didn't mention the quality of the pastries at his table. Apparently he didn't eat white flour. It says they didn't mention even the way that he prayed or the way that he fasted or his prowess as a commander in war, except to say that he had mercy on those people over whom he was victorious. Nearly every single one of the hadith that was mentioned by Twitter followers, Muslims from every corner of the world, described how the Prophet treated other people and how that shaped the way they in turn treated other people. So one man told me that he always texted his wife before he came home because the Prophet used to send a messenger to his wife as a courtesy to her. Another described how patient he was with his children because he had the image of the Prophet praying and the children climbing on his back. Another described the beauty of the Prophet's respect for his daughter and how that brought them to have respect for their own children, not only to treat them with love, but to treat them with respect. Described many, many little discreet acts of kindness, many of them to the most vulnerable people in society, of generosity, of a smile that the prophet accounted as charity. There were the incisive words, and this really touched me, to a Bedouin who never showed affection to his own children, telling him, "How can I teach you faith when you've forsaken simple human kindness?" If I'm going to be remembered in 1,385 years, my hope is that I'm also going to be remembered for my kindness to others, for my simplicity, my patience, for my relationship with others. Maybe I don't have any of those qualities yet, but I hope that I will. But I found something deeper, and I think something which is world-changing. Again and again, my Twitter followers, again, Muslims from every corner of the world, pointed not only to the Prophet's behavior with others, but very specifically to the behavior of the Prophet in moments of conflict. Again and again, people told the story of the woman who dumps her garbage on his front porch every day, and on one day she's too sick to do it, right? And he goes and he visits her. And by the way, I've been told the story may not be authentic. My rabbi once told me a story about a rabbi. It was kind of a wild story. If anyone wants to hear it afterwards, I'll be happy to tell you. And I told him, I said, "Rabbi, I'm really doubting this story is really authentic." And he says, "That may be so, but people don't tell stories like this about you." So in any case. But the tale, the story, is an amazing story because it's a story about emotional maturity. And it's about a deep insight. The Prophet understood in the story that the woman's contempt for him was not really for him. Her contempt was for what she thought he was, not for who he really was. And when she saw who he really was, when he visited her when she was sick, she saw who he really was. He was patient enough to wait for that moment and to take that moment to show who he really was. People described incidents when groups of opponents would insult the Prophet on the street, and even as his protective young wife Aisha lost her temper, he counseled her, "Calm down," reminding her of the benefit of gentleness. Many quoted him saying to Aisha, "You must be gentle. Truly, gentleness is not in anything, but that it beautifies it, and it is not removed from anything, but that it disgraces it." CNN, Fox, Vox, your Facebook page, your Twitter page, pick the news source you first see every day. Every single one tells the same tale of a world dominated by that removal of gentleness. Petty aggression, differences, petty aggressions that are fanned by false religion and nationalistic fervor into grotesque brutality. We're divided by our politics, our religions, our sects, our nationalities, our races. Every day the great pie of humanity is sliced into smaller and smaller slices, and people teach their children to love only their little sliver and to hate the rest of the pie. From the White House to the Wild West of social media, we are overcome by an increasingly ugly troll culture, disgraceful in its lack of gentleness, fairness, or graciousness. And there are those for whom violence is now the only answer to every question. Those who create the growing human rubble all over the planet. This is a diseased world. There are many symptoms, but the disease is the same. 1,385 years after his passing, my Twitter followers pointed to their prophet as the antidote to this disease. They saw him, and they see him, as the human embodiment of a culture of kindness, robust enough to face not only difference, but even to face conflict in a way that promotes grace and peace. So in keeping with the Jewish tradition, I'd like to end by invoking for us, all of us together, a blessing. I'd like to ask the Ribono Shel Olam, the Master of the world, that she should bless all of us, that in 1,385 years, we too will be remembered as those who were kind to those around us, as those who were charitable, and those who were generous with our smile. But above all, I want to invoke the blessing upon all of us that we be remembered as those who turned our ugly, divided world around, who are brave enough, mature enough, faithful enough to face even the most profound differences squarely, but with love and respect. I want to invoke the blessing on all of us that we be remembered in 1,385 years from now as faithful and fearless pursuers of peace. I'd like to end with a Hebrew rendition of Surat al-Fatiha. You'll recognize some of the words, they're cognate words. B'Shem Elohim harachaman v'harachum, Hatchila l'Elohim rav kol amim, harachaman v'harachum melech yom hadin, Otcha na'avod elecha nashuv, Hanchenu b'derech ha'yashar b'dacham she'ele asher netiach lahem, asher l'acharon apo alehem, v'lamin ha'to'im. It's my prayer for you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for this great opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wiseman. Our next guest is dear Dr. Sherman Jackson, and here's a small little intro about him. Dr. Sherman Jackson is the King Faisal Chair in Islamic Thought and Culture and Professor of